When I told my son I had lost my job, he came to my door with papers. He crossed the threshold and set a leather folder on my coffee table. "Sign here," he said. "This protects our family from risk." He used a calm voice. He sounded like a man who helps other people avoid trouble. He had a neat tie and a firm handshake. He looked like someone who had made good choices. "My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 68. For 10 years, I worked part-time at the Willoughby Public Library. I shelved books. I stamped the due dates. I helped old children find their favorite stories. It was a small job. It paid enough for food and rent. After my husband died, the library gave me something to do. They gave me a reason to leave the house. 3 days before my son arrived with the folder, the director called me into her office. "Evelyn," she said, looking at her calendar. "I am sorry. The town has cut funding. We must cut hours. We will have to let you go," she said, it like she was reading an old note. She handed me a small cardboard box. I packed my things in 15 minutes. I drove home in a kind of fog. The next morning the mailman knocked. He held a certified letter. "Sign for this, please," he said. I signed. The envelope was from a law firm in Zurich. I opened it at my kitchen table. The paper told me my great-aunt Agatha had died. She left me her estate. The number on the page made me sit down. $900 million. I read the sentence 3 times to make sure it meant what I thought. I put the paper down and made tea. I felt calm. The calm was a little strange. I did not call my son. I did not tell my neighbor. I sat with the letter in my lap and thought about how my life might be different now. I had met Aunt Agatha only once. She was a thin woman with gray hair and many rings. We saw her at a family reunion 30 years ago. She talked about paintings and small things that made me smile. She never married. She had no children. Her work with old European estates had made her wealthy. The letter said she remembered me speaking with interest about a painting back then. That was enough. The next morning Mark called. "Mom, I heard about the library," he said. "We have been thinking. Lena and I think you should move to a smaller place. It will be easier on everyone." Lena, my daughter-in-law, sounded practical. She always sounded practical when I told her I was tired. Mark had told me to be realistic. He had told me he loved me in the same sentence he told me I was a burden. When Mark came that afternoon, he walked in like he owned the house. He set the leather folder on my table with an air of quiet victory. "This is smart planning," he said. He had researched protecting families from liability, he told me. He spread papers on my coffee table and pointed to signature lines. "Sign here," he said. "If you sign, any debts you leave behind will not become our burden. When you die broke, your debts stay yours." He said the last sentence like it was a fact of nature. His words hit me like a cold wind. "Loser," he said. That was his voice. Not loud. Not cruel. Calm. He called me a loser. He said it in the same way he would say the library was closing. A practical notice. I felt a sharp small pain in my chest. He thought I would be poor soon. He thought I would cost his family money. He wanted to protect his life from my future. I did not argue. I did not cry. I took the pen and signed where he pointed. After he left, I sat very still. I had played the role of the helpless mother for a long time. I had accepted grocery lists and small favors. I had stayed quiet when they spoke about plans and realities. That night, I slept with the letter from Zurich folded under my pillow. I dreamed of small bright things. Birds, a small boat. When I woke, the dreams felt like plans. The Swiss law firm called that morning. Mr. Keller introduced himself with a careful voice. He spoke in English and said the estate was real. He spoke about properties in Zurich, London, New York, and Nice. He said there were paintings and bank accounts. He asked if I wanted to speak to his associate about setting up trusts and purchases. He asked what I would like to do. I felt oddly sure of one thing. I wanted to keep my name. I wanted to keep my dignity. I wanted to know what had really happened in that room. When Mark made me sign the papers, He had tried to keep me out of trouble by making me sign. He had drawn a line between us. He had thought I would be a problem. The thought of that clear line made me quiet and steady. I told Mr. Keller I wanted to learn more. He asked me to call back later. I called Jonathan Price. Jonathan had been my husband's lawyer. He had a small office on Main Street. He knew me. He knew my voice. When I handed him the letter from Zurich, he read it once slowly and then twice. The second time his eyes narrowed. "Evelyn," he said finally, "this is real." He told me he would help. He said we should meet with Swiss counsel and plan carefully. I felt a small thrill. The world had quietly shifted. Something was now possible. That evening, Mark called again. "Mom, are you job hunting?" he asked. He wanted to be helpful. "Maybe," I said. "I may take my time." He sighed. "We're trying to be realistic, Mom." I listened. This time I felt no anger. I felt something like curiosity. What would it be like to be treated like a person with resources? Would they take me back? Would they apologize? I made myself a cup of tea and put Agatha's letter on the table. The paper looked plain and honest in the light from the lamp. I set the kettle to boil. I decided to call back the Swiss law firm and ask about a small transfer. I wanted to begin. The call with Mr. Keller lasted 2 hours. He spoke slowly about trusts and holdings. "There are several properties," he said. "There are 3 large paintings of note. We will need direction." I wrote everything down. My hand moved like a student at a desk again. I tried to understand the vocabulary. Liquid assets meant money. I could move quickly. Interests meant earnings. After a while, the words became ordinary. At the end of the call, I asked for a small amount moved to my American account. $5 million, I said. "To begin, Mr. Keller sounded surprised. "That is a large first transfer," he said. "Very well, we will arrange it." The money came into my bank account a week later. I stared at the numbers and felt the electric sense of new reality. I had more money than I had ever dreamed. $5 million felt like power. I told Jonathan everything. I told him I wanted to make careful moves. I did not want melodrama. I wanted to be smart. I wanted to teach a lesson, but not by cruelty. He listened. He suggested safe ways to learn about the town's businesses. "Look for opportunities," he said. "Be discreet. Use intermediaries. We can set up holding companies if you wish." He wrote notes for me. He was kind but exact. He knew the language of deals. He had a manner I trusted. I sat in the coffee shop, Willow Brew, with my laptop open. People there knew me as the woman who read the newspapers. Now I read financial filings and business registries. I researched Harrison Risk Solutions, the insurance company where Mark worked. The company looked steady on the outside. It served many local businesses. Public records gave me an impression of value. I guessed the price might be small for my new resources. Perfect. Next I looked up Lena's design firm. It operated from a rented office on Oak Street. She had a small staff. She relied on a few good clients. Her profit margin did not seem large. That could change, I thought. I did not want to harm their lives. I wanted them to learn. I wanted them to feel what it was like to be powerless for a time. Work and money teach lessons quickly. Jonathan made quiet calls. He arranged introductions through middlemen. People asked who the buyer was. We said European investors, and left it at that. The word foreign opened doors. Owners like new money. They took calls faster. Lena's landlord, I learned, had been open to offers. The owner of the small Oak Street building had trouble finding a buyer at the time. A fair offer would move things quickly. By the end of the week, Jonathan called, smiling. "The building's owner accepted your price," he said. "We own the property." I held the phone and smiled. I celebrated by buying a small bag of fresh bread. It was the same little pleasure I had when my husband was alive. Money bought small comforts easily. The feeling of being able to do things without asking was new. We made an offer for Harrison Risk Solutions. It was a tidy business. I learned the brothers who owned it had grown tired and were open to sale. The family wanted a simple exit. They wanted a buyer who would not cause trouble. We promised to keep existing operations the same. We promised to keep jobs. That comforted them. They agreed far faster than I had expected. I told Jonathan I would not fire Mark at once. That was not my point. I wanted changes. Yes, I wanted him to see that his words had consequences. But I did not want revenge. That ruined lives. I wanted him to feel humility. I wanted him to remember the day he called me a loser and knew how cruel he had been in the voice he used. The day the deals closed, I went to the bank. I signed papers that made me the owner of companies and properties. I walked out lighter and straighter. My neighbors did not know the news. I wore an ordinary coat. I held my head high. There was a quiet pleasure in walking down Main Street and being simply myself and no one else's shadow. I called Mark to tell him we would meet to speak about the business. He sounded nervous, which was a small delight. He said he would meet me at 10 the next morning. I told him not to worry. No big changes at once, I said. Just a new owner in the building upstairs. He laughed a little. Very funny, Mom, he said. You're not buying a company as a joke. When I arrived at Harrison Risk Solutions the next morning, I sat in the corner of the conference room and watched Mark work. He was good at his job. He smiled at clients. He handled calls and forms with skill. It looked familiar. In the meeting I said I would honor current salaries and benefits. I wanted the staff to know they were safe. I told them I planned to invest in technology and training. The mood lightened. After the formalities, I asked to speak with Mark alone. He sat with both hands on his knees. How did you do this? He asked. I told him the truth. I told him about Aunt Agatha. He stopped breathing for a long moment. He looked at me, the way a man looks at a sudden bright thing. Is this real? He whispered. I nodded. He brought up the folder with the separation papers he had made me sign. He said he had only wanted to be prudent. I said I remembered the way the word loser had felt. He looked sick. I did not say much. I let him feel the weight of his own words. I told him I was not here to destroy him. I was here to teach what a life of judgment feels like. Later that week, Lena called crying. The landlord had been asked by the new owners to put the rent up. Her lease was month to month. The rent would triple. She could not afford it. I listened to her voice and felt the echo of her calculations. She had thought of me as an inconvenience once. Now she had to leave or change her life. I made an appropriate sympathetic sound and then quietly began to set things in motion. I did not take pleasure in suffering for its own sake. I had no hunger for damage. I wanted people to understand the moment when they stopped seeing another person fully. I wanted them to remember what family means. I wanted to see if they could find a better way now that they had seen the cost of their choices. The morning the sale to my holding company became final, I took an office next to the sales floor. I did not need to watch Mark. I wanted to learn the business and be present. I liked the hum of the office. I liked the way the staff moved. People greeted me politely, assuming I was a visiting investor. Mark saw me each morning and flinched in small ways. He learned the new normal slowly. Lena's rent notice came 2 days later. She called me from her small design studio. Her voice trembled. Evelyn, they are raising the rent. I can't pay that. I don't know what to do. I listened and made small encouraging noises. I had become the reason for her sleepless nights. For years, she had told me to plan, to be realistic, to avoid being a burden. Now she felt the cold air of being powerless. I felt a strange tug in my chest. Part of me wanted to make the rent easier. Another part of me wanted her to feel the reality she had planned for me. I did what was legally correct. Through a shell company, I became the landlord. I upheld the lease terms. The rent went up. I watched the business falter from my office. A month later, Lena lost key clients who could not follow her to a more distant studio. Her flagship contract disappeared. She called me, voice shaking. "I am trying to make it work," she said, "but I may have to close." Mark came to my office with the same soft anger he had used when he brought the separation papers. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. He spoke in low tones to avoid office ears. "You could just forgive us." I looked at him, steady and calm. "Forgiveness," I said slowly, "does not fix what was said." I opened a folder and put his words down in front of him, not to hurt him more, but to show him the truth of memory. He looked at the pages as if they might be maps to a foreign land. He grew quiet. That evening he sat on my couch and said, "We never thought you would get money. We only wanted to protect ourselves." "Protect yourself," I said, "is the phrase you used. You chose insulation instead of care." He could not meet my eyes. The next day I had my attorney send an official letter. The mortgage for his house was now owned by Willoughby Savings, which I had purchased quietly through another holding vehicle. He did not know yet that I was the bank that now held his loan. I watched events unfold like a slow film. Lena closed her design studio a month after the rent increase. Her bankruptcy followed. Mark lost major clients who moved to the new insurance provider we had been advising. His commissions lagged. His free time decreased. He came home pale and tired, and said very little. He had not expected the chain of events. Neither had I, exactly. I had hoped for wakefulness, not ruin. The line between consequence and ruin sometimes becomes thin. One evening, they came to my small apartment together. They sat like two people waiting for a sentence. "We want to make this right," Lena said. Her voice was a thread. Mark nodded, face hollow. He said they had talked, and realized they had treated me like a problem, and not a person. "We are sorry," he said plainly. I listened. This time I felt nothing like triumph. I felt the odd dryness of a person who had reached an endpoint. "What do you want?" Lena asked finally, tears on her cheeks. "Do you want an apology?" "I do not want only apology," I said. "I wanted understanding. I would like you to know how it feels to be decided for, to be counted out, before the evidence is in. I would like you to feel the small fear that comes with being powerless." They both nodded and promised many things. They said they would be more present. They said they would help where they could. The next weeks were busy with business decisions. The Monaco apartment sold for a large price. The press said nothing about an elderly woman in Willoughby. The town remained the same on its surface. Yet everything in their private lives had shifted. Lena moved her family to a smaller town. Mark worked late hours and worried about bills he had never imagined worrying over. I watched from my office window as the family pattern changed. A private investigator left messages for me that Aunt Agatha had anticipated family friction. The papers Aunt Agatha left included notes. She had been careful. She had studied each member and left a test. The test asked whether wealth would change a person's heart. If someone had proved love when there was no gain, she would reward them. If they had not, she would not. I read this and felt a small-known shock. It seemed odd and cruel and wise all at once. I called them both to my apartment again. I laid out some of the documents, only some. I told the truth. Aunt Agatha had recorded family conversations. She had watched how people acted when they thought no one important was looking. The papers contained lists and transcriptions that made my son's face go pale. He had no defense, not a good one. She wanted to see character, I told them. She left it to fate and privacy, and then to me. Mark said he had not known. Lena cried and said she had been practical, not cruel. I said I understood that people make mistakes. I told them I would not take pleasure in ruin, but I would hold them accountable. I would make them live with their choices. That night they left my apartment, like two people learning to bow under weight. They looked older and softer. They held hands in a new way. In the days that followed, I made quiet decisions. I would leave the grandchildren provided for. Aunt Agatha had insisted on that. The children would not pay for their parents' errors. I arranged trusts and college funds and small stable gifts. I kept what I believed they needed most. For Mark and Lena, I let the consequences of their choices stand. I wanted them to know how it felt to be at someone else's mercy. I wanted them to consider the choices they made when they thought it was only paper and talk. I sat in my chair at home and thought about who I had been. The woman who had signed those papers had felt small. The woman who now signed bank transfers felt steady. I felt the distance between being helpless and having power. It was a hard line. I had used my new life to teach a lesson. The lesson had a cost. I had a strange emptiness from the victory. I had learned that making someone hurt to teach them was not sweet. It was necessary, perhaps, but not sweet. At night I looked at the simple photographs on my mantel. They showed days when I was simply their mother. I wondered if anything could return to that innocence. I knew only this: respect should not depend on account balances. Love should not be a calculation. I made tea and sat quietly and decided to spend some of the money where it would not change anyone's face, for small good in the town, for children, for the people who had always loved without question. The rest I kept as a lesson and as a promise to myself. Nothing in my life would be taken for granted again. News moved through Willoughby like slow water. People did not know the names of the companies I had bought. They did not know the quiet woman who had once shelved books was now a major owner of town businesses. The hardware store on Elm, the small daycare on River Street, a little diner on Market, they all changed hands. The owners sold willingly. Money solves many problems. I watched the town from my new office window. I saw children at the daycare through the glass. I saw Mr. Ed Delgado at the hardware store, talking to a customer. I liked the steady work of owning useful things. It felt honest. Mark and Lena kept their house for a while. The mortgage payments came in on time. They began to understand small details of life they had ignored. Lena learned how to check invoices. Mark learned that client loyalty is fragile. They both walked a little straighter and spoke more softly. Once or twice, Mark met my eyes in the hallway and tried to speak like the old son he had been. He said things like, "How are you, Mom?" And I answered plainly. The distance that had been there slowly thinned. But respect is not simply a physical closeness. It is a practice. Their words had to match their deeds. I formed a small charity with Jonathan and Mr. Keller. We wrote rules and named projects. The charity paid for arts programs at the library, though the library staff still did not know I had money. I wanted to give quietly. I thought small acts could heal things that money alone could not. We set up after-school reading for children. We gave grants to single parents who did night school. We paid for a small clinic that helped people who could not otherwise see a doctor. The projects pleased me because they helped people who had not sought wealth. That felt right. Mark began to show small changes. He volunteered one evening to come with me to the clinic when I went to speak with the director. He stood in the corner and took notes like a man who was learning a new job. Lena sent a letter to some old clients, offering support and small discounts. She tried to rebuild trust by offering better service. These moves were practical and slow. They were not yet full apologies. They were first steps. I watched and waited. Yet even as they tried to repair things, I discovered other truths. People change not only when money is moved, but when public stories are told. Once a rumor started that an outsider investor had bought the diner to flip it. Lines formed at a different breakfast spot. Small businesses felt fragile again. I called meetings. I used my influence to reassure owners that change could mean stability, not ruin. I wanted to show that money could be used to protect small lives, not to frighten them. One afternoon, a woman named Rosa, who ran a small bakery, knocked at my door. She was older than me in some ways. Her hands were flour-worn. She had fed this town for 30 years with pastries and small kindnesses. She told me quietly that the bakery had lost a morning route. Someone had canceled a large order. Her worry was plain. I sat with her at my kitchen table and listened. She did not know I owned other things. I told her then that I would hire the bakery for events held by the charity. "We will keep you moving," I said. Rosa cried and touched my hand. That moment felt honest. It was why I wanted to have money to keep people's daily work alive. At home, I kept some of Aunt Agatha's papers in a locked drawer. They were private and heavy. I read them sometimes like faint maps. She had kept lists and notes. She had written small judgments about people's habits. She had believed in testing character. Some of her notes felt wise. Some felt bitter. I used them not like a judge, but like a memory. She had given me a certain view of human nature, that people show their true face when they think no one will notice. I thought about this often. It made me careful. One morning, Mark arrived at my office with a face I did not fully recognize. He had been up late. He looked tired. He said he wanted to remain at the company, if that was possible. He also said he wanted to take a class about client relations and ethics that I had paid for. "I want to be better," he said. The words surprised me because of how ordinary they were. Ordinary words sometimes matter most. He took the class. He tried to be better at the small things, returning calls promptly, admitting mistakes, offering refunds when appropriate. The office noticed. The staff appreciated it. He learned that being in charge meant a duty to care. Yet there were nights when I felt the old hollow taste of victory and nothing else. I had taught a lesson, but the lesson felt heavy on both sides. Sometimes I wondered if there could be a way to make people change without pain. That was a question with no sure answer. I kept doing small good and held my decisions steady. Then news arrived that changed the town again. A developer from the city wanted to buy a strip of land near the river. They wanted to build fancy houses. It would have driven up rents and pushed small owners out. I called a meeting with other local owners. We discussed counteroffers. I offered to buy the parcel and keep it for community use. The offer shocked some people. They called it a generous move. Others whispered that I was keeping power, but I saw a larger truth. Wealth can close doors or open them. I wanted to open one. We secured the land and planned a small park and affordable units. The council praised the idea. I felt relief and a simple joy. The park opened months later with a small ribbon and children's laughter. I stood at the edge of the green and watched little ones run. That day I felt close to a small kind of happiness. It was the kind that repairs bridges, not the kind that burns them. Mark watched the ribbon cutting on the news and sent me a short message. "Good work," he wrote. It was a short message, but it mattered because it was clean and true. Lena sent photos of an office she had found in a cheaper area with a sign that said reopening. Her voice in the message sounded steadier. That night, I made tea and sat by my window and thought about how things can shift slowly. I thought about how the paper I had signed long ago and the paper Mark had made me sign both lay heavy on our lives. I thought about choices and about what people do when they finally see the harm they have caused. I kept giving quietly. I kept buying small things for the town that would not show up in headlines. I bought a used van for the clinic. I paid for a music teacher at the school. I sent a letter to Rosa with a check and a note that said, "For bread and better mornings." These things felt like small stitches. They did not erase what had happened. They were not meant to. They were repair. Sometimes, late at night, I would wonder if my life had become the story of the test. I wondered if I had been too harsh. I had not sought ruin for people I loved. I had sought to show them their choices. But a life that reshapes others must be careful. I promised myself to remain humane. I would hold firmness and mercy together, even if they did not always fit perfectly. I would not let power make me cruel for the sake of lesson alone. Spring came warm to Willoughby. Trees opened their small hands of green. The town smelled of dirt and new paint. People came out of winter gloom and worked in yards and shops. The clinic's waiting room filled with small children who coughed and laughed. The park's benches filled with parents and grandparents watching toddlers chase pigeons. Life bent toward ordinary things again. That was the most healing sign. Mark and Luna's life had new rhythms. Luna's new studio opened in a small building on the edge of town. She painted a sign herself and hung it in a window. Her clients were fewer but steady. She learned new skills and took small loans I had arranged to help her get started. Mark's work steadied as we invested in better service and faster claims. He came in earlier and left later. He sometimes stopped by the breakfast at the diner and offered free advice to young salespeople. Small acts like that changed him. I kept my office small and my manners quieter. People started to ask who had been making the donations. Some suspected a foundation. Others guessed a private donor. I let the idea of anonymity suit me. I liked being a neighbor who did not ask for fuss. I liked the way people smiled when they saw someone they thought was simply kind. That day-by-day kindness felt like a new way to be wealthy. Still, the key tension remained. Had the lesson stuck? I watched small signs. Mark now left notes for his mother in the kitchen. Simple notes, like dinner at own time. Love and for, took the car in for service. They were small, but they showed presence. Luna called more often, asking if I needed help around the apartment. The apologies had become actions. At a community dinner one night, Mark stood to speak. He thanked the donors and the volunteers. He spoke about service and respect. He mentioned his mother briefly, and then looked down. Many in the room clapped. I felt something warm in my chest, because public words like that often mean private change. He had learned to say thank you publicly. He had learned to be seen as part of the community again. Yet there were hard moments. One day, an angry letter arrived at my office. A local columnist wrote that a private woman was changing the town without consulting residents. The piece accused me of playing games. I read it and then set it aside. I could have answered with a public note. Instead, I called a neighborhood meeting. I invited small business owners and some residents. I listened to their complaints. People wanted transparency and a chance to voice opinion. I opened the books on the park project and the clinic funding. I showed accounts and plans. People felt better when they could see details. It taught me something important. People want to be part of decisions that affect them. Power without participation breeds distrust. I learned and acted. Time passed in small cycles. The children I had helped, at the library's after-school program, began to win small prizes in reading contests. Rose's Bakery regained its rhythm and hired another assistant. The diner's owner thanked me and gave me a pie one afternoon. Small pleasures. I liked the way ordinary gratitude felt, plain and direct. Mark asked to meet me alone one afternoon. He sat at my kitchen table and placed an envelope down. Inside was a folded sheet. It was a letter he had written months ago and had not sent. He said he had written many things, but could not always say them. He had written, "I was wrong. I was frightened. I treated you like a problem when I should have been family." He asked forgiveness plainly. He did not ask to be restored to the old way. He only asked to do better. I looked at him. He had aged a little since this began. He had a new softness in his shoulders. "I accept that you try to be better," I said, "and I will help where I can. But respect is earned by what you do, not by words alone." He nodded. We had a quiet lunch. The conversation was not theatrical. It was a simple step forward. Meanwhile, I kept following Aunt Agatha's notes, but with caution. Some of her recommendations were useful. Others seemed petty. I asked Jonathan to help me decide which to use. He reminded me that any plan should be tempered by humanity. I tried to temper my moves with mercy. I also kept the children's trusts untouched. The grandchildren had never asked for this test. They were innocent of the family's faults and would not pay for them. One afternoon, I read an old letter from my deceased husband. He had written about small kindnesses in life. He had said that dignity was quiet but unbreakable, if defended softly. I thought of his voice and of the small ways they had once loved me. My actions had been heavy. His note asked for something gentler. I wondered if the lesson I had taught could be softened by actions that were not only corrective, but also restorative. So I started a small program to retrain workers who lost jobs when business shifted. The program offered short classes in bookkeeping and client services. Many who had lost work found steady part-time jobs. Mark himself taught a session on customer relationships. One evening, he stood in front of a small group and spoke of his mistakes and what he had learned. People listened quietly. That night, a woman came up to him and said, "Thank you for being honest." The word honest mattered because it meant he was showing the work he had done. As months moved into a new season, the family settled into a new normal. We had scars. We had small repairs. I had learned that power could be used to protect and to teach. I had also learned that I could choose to be kind. That choice did not erase past harms. It made a future where people had the chance to be better. Maybe that was the greatest lesson of all. Summer arrived with heat and a long, slow calm. Willoughby's days stretched out with farmers' markets and yard sales. The park filled with people who had not been able to imagine it months before. I walked there early in the morning and watched the light. The town had changed shape, but its heart still beat with small acts of neighborliness. I liked to see the little things that money could not buy. Mark and Lena were doing the ordinary work of living now. Lena had a small, steady client who loved her style. Mark had rebuilt some of his client list with better service and honesty. He called me less often to report crises and more often to share small successes. Once he brought fresh flowers to my apartment, for no special reason. He left them on the table with a short note that read, "For the woman who deserves better than my first thoughts." I kept the flowers and the note. The words had weight because they were quiet and earned. There were still hard days. One afternoon, Lena's sister called and said she felt ashamed of what had happened. The family had trouble forgiving itself. They asked whether things could ever be the same. I replied that time and acts answer that question. Forgiveness is slow and must be practiced. They worked at it. Some days were better. Some days old patterns returned. It is human to struggle with deep habits. I continued to use my wealth in small, efficient ways. I bought a new roof for the daycare. I paid for a school trip for children who could not otherwise afford to go. I funded a scholarship for a young woman who wanted to study nursing. These were not grand gestures. They were practical tools that kept people moving forward. They did not erase wrongs, but they helped people to survive and sometimes to thrive. A local reporter asked for an interview. He wanted to write about the anonymous benefactor who had helped so many things in town. I agreed to an interview on one condition: no sensational headlines. I wanted the facts told with care. He listened and then wrote a piece that focused on the small human projects and not on the drama. The town read it, and many people nodded. Some people apologized privately. Others asked for help. I answered quietly. One evening, Mark came to my apartment with a small box. He sat down and said, "We want you to know we are building a small fund ourselves to help others." He had taken earnings from a sale and set them aside to assist neighbors. "We learned a hard way," he said. "We do not want others to feel what we made you feel." The gesture made me look at him in a new light. He had learned not only to be careful with words, but to create change himself. Lena and I had a long conversation about art and small things. She told me that when she met clients, she now began by asking what they needed and listening. She said that being asked to move had been an awful shock, but also a turning point. She had learned to be aware of the people around her, to notice when someone needed help. The change felt humble and true. I liked to see people learn empathy through practice, yet I also had to be careful with the power I held. Once a developer tried to pressure a small shop owner to sell. The owner hesitated under the pressure of a large upfront offer. I intervened quietly and made a fair counteroffer that kept the owner in place. The owner wept and hugged me in the doorway. I felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. The town could stay safe if choices were made with care, but the need to protect people was never ending. One day, I received a letter from an old friend in a nearby city. She had known my husband. She wrote about small memories and about how she remembered me stepping into the sunlight with grace, even when life was hard. Her words reminded me of the small dignity I had once felt without wealth. Money did not change that dignity. It only gave me more options to act on it. I kept the letter where I could read it when I needed a reminder of gentler values. The grandchildren came to visit through the summer. I set up a small scholarship fund for their education. The children played and laughed and did not understand the adult weight around them. That was a mercy. They built sand castles and read picture books and asked for simple things. I loved them quietly. They had not asked for tests or fortunes. They were innocent and always would be. Mark and Lena's relationship shifted as well. They grew careful with each other, but also more tender. Repair takes time. They went to counseling. They wrote small notes to one another, to remind of promises. I noticed these small acts and felt the old hurt soften a little. I continued my habit of small, quiet giving. I kept the secret of some donations, because giving without recognition can be a way to let the world heal without more ego. Yet I also gave public support to community projects that needed visibility. I wanted to find a balance between anonymity and leadership. I found that both are useful, one to preserve humility, the other to build trust. One evening, I walked through the park and stopped near the small pond. The light from the street lamps reflected in the water and looked like simple coins thrown into the dark. I thought about choices and consequences, and about how one woman's quiet will could ripple. I had been given an impossible amount of money. I had been given the chance to use it with thought. I had tried to do so. I had made mistakes. I had corrected them. I had learned mercy. As summer drew down, I received a note from Rosa at the bakery. She thanked me for the help and invited me to a small celebration. The bakery had hired an assistant, and the storefront looked bright. I went to the celebration in a plain dress. Rosa hugged me and gave me a small tart. The people at the party were ordinary neighbors. They laughed and shared bread. I sat among them and felt a warmth that money cannot create. It was the warmth of being a neighbor who listens. That night I walked home with crumbs in my bag and the soft idea that perhaps the lesson had changed more than one heart. I had not become a saint. I remained a woman who had learned how to shape power with care. I slept and dreamed of small things again. The world was not perfect, but it had eased. The town was steadier, and that steadiness felt like a small victory. Autumn painted Willoughby in soft golds. Leaves fell and the town prepared for harvest fairs. The library reopened a children's reading corner, funded by the charity. I watched the first session. Children sat on cushions and listened to a woman read a story about a brave crow. The simple joy in their faces warmed me. Small things like that made life lighter. Mark and Lena had a quiet dinner with me. One evening, over soup and bread, we spoke of future plans. Mark said he wanted to launch a small community outreach team at the insurance firm to help small businesses navigate claims fairly. Lena wanted to teach a weekend class at the community college on design for small budgets. Both wished to build things that would give back. I listened and felt a soft approval. These plans were grounded and not grand. They showed a change of heart, Word of our project spread beyond Willoughby. A neighboring town invited us to speak about community banking and ethical ownership. I went with Mark and Lena as a panel. We spoke plainly. They asked hard questions. People in the audience wanted to know how to use money to help and not harm. We told the truth. Listen, share power, and involve the community in decisions. I spoke about the park and how a small vote had given people a voice. I watched faces in the crowd and saw that some had learned from our story. Back home, a small scandal surfaced. A businessman accused me of using my money to favor projects connected to people I knew. The accusation had some bite, and a few people were angry. I answered openly and set up a community advisory board for future funds. I chose members from different backgrounds and gave them real authority to decide. They included farmers, school teachers, and Mr. Delgado from the hardware store. Giving people real voice changed the tone of things. It made me less a shadow and more a partner. The town responded well. Meanwhile, the grandchildren grew. I set aside funds for their education. I also set a rule that they would volunteer for community projects when old enough. I wanted them to learn responsibility and to see how small hands help in real ways. The eldest, Ruth, loved to organize book drives. She arranged a small box of books for children in shelters. She did this with quiet joy. My heart was full when I saw her at work. I continued to study Aunt Agatha's old notes, but with a softer lens. Some of her tests had seemed harsh, yet I could not deny her curiosity about human character. I wrote a letter to her memory and put it in a small box. I am not sure why I did it. Perhaps to say thanks for the clarity and to apologize for the sharp edges. Then I closed the box and put it away. Winter approached, and the town prepared small festivals. The clinic held a fundraiser, and the charity matched donations. The library planned a holiday concert. I bought tickets and handed them to families who could not afford to go. I liked the way music made people feel together. It was a simple thing, and that simplicity had value. One evening in December, Mark stood at the window and turned to me. "Mom," he said quietly, "I want to say something public." He had never been comfortable with attention. He had been raised to avoid drama, but he now stood with a new steadiness. He cleared his throat and told a small story about a library and a woman who had been kind and patient. He spoke of being wrong and learning. People in the room listened and then clapped. The applause felt real and not theatrical. He had done something that mattered. Lena opened a small gallery the next month with paintings made by local artists. She hung her first poster on the wall and invited neighbors. The gallery's first show sold to people who had been customers of hers before. Her face glowed. She had not only rebuilt her life, but had also given others a place to show their work. The move felt humble and large at once. I kept the charity's focus on the small day-by-day things: tutors, clinic hours, apprenticeships. I did not want the money to feel like a hammer. I wanted it to be a tool for steady building. The advisory board helped make good choices. People began to suggest projects. The town began to feel like it had a say in its future again. As the year ended, I wrote a note and left it in Mark's desk. It was short. "I forgive what I can. I will help where I can. Let us keep learning." He read it and then called me. He said nothing more than "thank you," but his voice trembled with something like relief. Forgiveness is a process. It needs time. It needs practice. We both had work to do. At night, I sat by the window and looked at the town's rooftops. The lights were soft. The town had not become a perfect place. People still argued and made mistakes. But people also learned. They helped neighbors and bought bread from Rose's bakery. The day-by-day kindness mattered more than the test's verdict. I had used a strange tool to show a hard truth. I had tried to reshape things with care. The result was messy and real. I had one final plan that felt necessary. I asked Jonathan to help me set up a small lecture series at the college on ethics and community. We invited speakers who had done ethical business in small towns. The lectures filled with curious minds. People asked hard questions about power and responsibility. The talks were honest and sometimes uncomfortable. That was good. The town needed a place to speak and learn. On the last day of the year, I sat quietly with a cup of tea and thought about the months that had passed. I had been small and then large in the world's eyes. I had used that largeness carefully and sometimes clumsily. I had learned to pair firmness with mercy. I had seen people try to change. That felt like a gift. I made a small promise to continue this way, to keep the family safe and the town honest, to give as quietly as possible, and to help where the need was real. A new year arrived with clear air. Willoughby felt different, but steady. The park bloomed with early crocuses. The library's reading circle had new volunteers. The clinic had a waiting list, but fewer emergency cases, because people had better access to care. Life moved forward in its small rhythms. The town had found a new balance. Mark and Lena had new routines. They took turns bringing soup to my apartment. They helped with small tasks, and sometimes sat with me as we watched old films. Their voices had softened. They still had regrets. They still sometimes apologized, but apologies were now accompanied by steady behavior. That is the part that mattered most. The charity took on a new partner to expand apprenticeship programs. We connected high school students with local tradespeople and small businesses. The program taught bookkeeping, customer service, and a little courage. Students who once thought small dreams could not grow now saw practical steps to make a life in Willoughby that gave me more hope than any headline ever could. One late afternoon, a woman came by my office who had once been distant and cold. She had been a neighbor who kept distance and judged quietly. She sat down and said, "I was wrong to not speak up when it mattered." She had a small cake and a request to volunteer at the library reading circle. She wanted to help. I smiled. People change in strange, slow ways. Small acts of regret can build bridges. Ruth, the eldest grandchild, wrote to me from a college open day. She wrote that she planned to study social work. She described a teacher who had changed her life and how she wanted to give back. I pressed the letter to my chest and felt a calm happiness. The future looked like people who would choose to care. As spring edged in, a small festival celebrated local crafts. Lena displayed a few of her designs. She sold pieces and gave a talk on balancing creativity and business. Mark helped run a booth, offering advice on small business insurance. He gave free mini consultations. The festival hummed with people who had never imagined such community energy months before. In the quiet moments, I sometimes took out Aunt Agatha's boxes and read them again. Her notes had been a spark. They had revealed things that were already there. She had given me a lens to see character. I had used it, but I also learned to put the lens down when it was not needed. People are not tests. People are stories that change. I kept the records not as weapons, but as reminders to choose mercy. One afternoon, I received a letter from a distant cousin who had been estranged for years. She asked for kindness and said she had been ashamed of past words. We met with tea and old photos. She apologized for small cruelties. The meeting was gentle and true. I realized I had spent a long time thinking about proving a point. Now I found small pleasures in reconciliation. It did not erase the past. It softened the future. I kept giving, quietly and openly. I kept funding small things that mattered. I kept the grandchildren provided for, not as trophies, but as help to learn and to serve. I kept a small fund to help people in true need. I kept my life simple in the middle of the new possibilities. I liked the quiet of small rooms and the smell of library books. Mark and Lena came by one September evening with a small framed picture. It was a photo of the family at the park, taken the week the green opened. They handed it to me and said, "We want this to hang in your living room." I hung the picture above the couch. It was not a full reconciliation. It was not even a perfect one. It was a living piece, a sign of small progress. People in Willoughby remembered the test and the changes like an odd chapter. Some told the story as a caution. Some told it as a miracle. I did not mind how it was told. I only cared about what it had begun. The town had learned to ask for voice and to share power. The family had learned to show respect even when convenience suggested otherwise. I was not naive enough to think everything would be perfect, but I had more faith in small repair than in dramatic reversals. One late night, I walked to the library and sat in the reading room. The lights were dim. A few late students were studying at the long table. I ran my fingers along the bindings of books and felt the quiet authority of stories. I thought about my long life. I had loved, lost, worked, and been surprised. I had been small and then unexpectedly large. I had used the size of the surprise to try to remake small things for the better. I took out a small paper and wrote 3 lines. The paper read, "Choose kindness. Speak truth. Keep listening." I put it in the front of a book and shelved it. It was a small act. It was what the town and my family needed most. The future would come with hard tests and easier chances. I hoped we would remember this time as one when people learned to be honest and kind. I hoped the lessons would grow in gentle and steady ways. I locked the library and walked home under the night sky. The stars felt like small lamps over a place that could still change for the better. I made myself a cup of tea and sat quietly. I was still Evelyn Carter, the woman who had once shelved books and then been called a loser. I was now someone else too, a woman who had used unexpected wealth to teach and to heal, who had learned mercy and who had tried to give her town a better chance. The lesson had been hard. The work would last a lifetime, but I felt ready to do it.